Welcome back to another weekly Ask GMBN Tech. You know the drill, this is the Ask Show. You get your technical questions in the comments underneath. Use the hashtag that you can see at the bottom of the screen there, and we'll give you some answers. Right, first question this week is from Cyan van der Velde. Hi, I use clipless pedals, they're Shimano ones, and I have a lot of problems clipping in because the area of the cleats on my shoes was clogged with dirt. Any advice on how to prevent or solve this? Well, to be fair, any generic style of clip-in shoe that's got cleats on the shoe can be subject to this, but you can always find a way of clipping in. Now let's just take a little leaf out of our cyclocross friends. Now arguably they race in the worst conditions of any cyclist, and a lot of them clip in and they don't seem to have any problems. Now there's a couple of ways it can be a problem for you. Now the cleat recess on a solo shoe, there should be some shots on screen so you can see this now. The cleat recess on certain shoes can be quite narrow. Now if there's not much room between the side of the cleat and the shoulders of the shoe, like in that recess, things like small stones can get stuck in there. Now they will definitely hinder you getting in. Mud, you can always find a way of clipping in, but if it's that really thick, compacted mud, you simply need to just knock it off. And actually, when you first do this, it feels like a bit of a chore to do it. But after a while, when you get used to riding in muddy conditions, I mean, I like to think of myself as an expert in it because we seem to just ride in nothing but mud in the UK. It just becomes, I don't even notice myself doing it. You know, maybe I'll clip out to stop and take a photo or something. And before clipping back in, I'll be like, bash my shoes on the pedal and away you go. You know, the more you walk on the ground, the harder it's going to be to engage. Now, I have heard some people waxing or using polish in that cleat recess on the sole of the shoe to stop mud sticking there, but in my experience, to be fair, just bashing it out before you clip in, before you engage. Now, you don't need to do it all the time, and certain pedals are a little bit easier to clip in the mud. Now, we use Crank Brothers here at GMBN. I don't find too much different between the two, between Shimano and Crank Brothers in the mud. However, there is an advantage with Crank Brothers over the Shimano ones, I feel, is if you get any of those little stones caught, the Shimano ones, because it's a proper jaw that locates over the back of the cleat, stones can interfere with that, whereas the Crank Brothers ones, because the jaws actually rotate around the centre of the pedal, doesn't seem to affect it quite as much. But ultimately, it's down to the sole of the shoe. Last resort, I guess, would be to trim some of the rubber away. I see quite a lot of racers doing that, particularly cross-country racers, trying to have a good, clear route of engagement. Good luck with that. Next question's from the MTBer, original name. Hey, can I fit my front 29er fork and wheel set in my 27.5-inch frame, kind of like a mullet? I just want to change my front wheel set and fork only. Also, what shifter do you prefer, Doddy? SLX M7000 or XT M8000? Okay, so well, the shifter, like I'm not a snob on transmissions, but I do prefer the higher end Shimano shifters, the XT and the XTR, because of the ability to multi-shift on the downshift. It's purely the only reason. They all work exactly the same and work like just as well. So I would pick an XT or actually an XTR. With transmission, I'd be happy to run D or SLX, no problems whatsoever. It works brilliantly, great value too. Now, with the fork, yes, arguably you could put that on your frame. So bearing in mind, by putting a longer fork and a bigger wheel on a smaller frame, you're going to change the angles of your frame. You're going to raise the bottom bracket height, you're going to slacken your seat angle and your head angle. Now, slackening the head angle, that's a good thing, gives you a bit of stability. Slackening the seat angle, not quite as good because it puts your weight further backwards when you're sat on the bike. So you can compensate a little bit for that by running your seat forwards and tilting it down a bit, so effectively puts it back where it was to start with. A high bottom bracket is great when you're riding in terrain with loads of rocks and that, so you don't get pedal strikes, and it makes it easier to tip the bike into turns. You just get a little less stability for that, and it can be harder to get off the bike if you're running your saddle at full height. But there is something else you need to take into account. I mean, of course, you can just put the fork on it and do that. Is the 29er forks have a different rake or a different offset to 27.5-inch forks. Now, just for example, a 27.5-inch fork might have a 38mm rake, and your 29 fork might have a 50mm rake. There's loads of different options available and different manufacturers spec them for different reasons. Now that will affect the way your bike handles. Now arguably you could get one with the same rake, but the ones that tend to offer those differences aftermarket tend to be a bit more expensive. So just take that into account when you do it, and you should be able to do it. Although I'm not sure I'd bother, to be honest. You could just run a slightly bigger front tyre if you want to bump up the front end and save yourself some cash. You could always increase the travel on your existing fork as well. There's loads of ways of doing that. maybe you should look at that before spending out on an expensive new fork and front wheel. Next question is from Jack Archibald. Hi Jack. How come people don't use fat bikes more as 4-season bikes, as they're extremely versatile, that can be used in any scenario, even downhill, especially with some companies like Foes that have really well developed geometry. The only drawback seems to be the increase in rolling resistance, which for some people they can power through. Let me know what you think. Okay, well, I don't think anyone is against fat bikes, but the tyres are very expensive, the tyres are very thin. So if you're riding in like extremely rocky conditions, for example, it's really easy to slash them. And pretty much once you slash a tyre of that size, it can be really tricky to fix it, which means sometimes having to buy a new tyre. Not good, my friend. Now, add to the fact as well, yeah, the rolling resistance is a problem with the fat bike, especially when one of the nicest things on any mountain bike, cross country or an enduro bike, is just whistling along single track, really nice and fast by your own steam. When you're on a fat bike and you're running generally lower pressures, admittedly, you could run them higher, you're fighting friction a lot of the time. The biggest thing you fight as a cyclist is air resistance, and then the rest is like what you get from the gravity, you get the friction on the ground. If you can reduce that, it's a nicer, much more fun experience. And as for mud, a lot of people would think a fat bike would be the best approach, you know, like a tractor going through mud, but actually thinner tyres are generally better in the mud, right? So it's harder to ride in extremely muddy conditions on cyclocross tyres, for example, which I'm going to use here. But look at cyclocross racing. It's a perfect example. So it was invented for cross-training purposes. That's what cyclocross stands for. So road cyclists basically would not just develop muscles for cycling. You know, they're actually using different muscles like would be for running, and also developing riding skill in the winter. Now you do see a lot of mountain bikers riding cyclocross, and everyone that knows about cyclocross and riding in mud will always pick a thinner tyre. Yep, you want an aggressive tyre, like a spike style tyre, like this motor that you can see on screen. Something like that works great in mud. But the aim is you want to cut through all that sloppy stuff on the top, and you're going to be gripping on the firmer mud underneath. On a fat bike, yeah, all right, so you could let the tyres down, have a massive footprint. That's great, so you will get traction, but also you're going to slide around on that slippy stuff on the top, so they don't always work the best. But that said, here's some shots of Blake on his fat bike. He loves the things, he's absolutely addicted to them, and he rides, as you can see, anything on them. Now this is an interesting question. What if I'm to use a Magura Julie brake with kitchen oil? Now in brackets, it works. Okay, so on all brakes, let me make this clear. Use the correct oil that's recommended. That's the only safe way of making sure your brake's operated, and of course making sure your brake pads are in good condition, your disc rotors are in good condition, and your brakes are bled. However, it is possible to fill your brakes with different fluid. Now, this will probably invalidate warranty and it can be dangerous. This should only be used in a get you home situation. Now, I managed to lose, I snapped a front brake hose, but it snaps right down by the caliper. And although I lost a load of oil and did contaminate my rotor, I did manage to sort of bodge it, basically trimming the hose back, getting it back on the banjo, and I filled it up with olive oil. This was on a foreign trip, and the brake worked well enough that I could have a brake to rely on, but I knew obviously it had to be changed, had to replace the brake pads in there and replace the hose and put correct oil in there. Now note, this won't really work on a dot oil brake. I'm not sure exactly why, but it just doesn't seem to work quite as well. I have tried that. But on a mineral oil brake, it works actually pretty well. You can get a good bleed with it and it can work quite consistently. However, as soon as it gets hot, you're going to get fade, you're going to get bubbles in it, it's going to heat up. It doesn't deal with the heat like proper braking fluid. So although you can do it, and actually I think Seth from Seth's Bike Hacks, he's done it with baby oil. Again, that's kind of a form of mineral oil. Yeah, you can do it, but you definitely shouldn't be doing it. Think of it as a last resort, a get you home thing. Just get the correct fluid. For God's sake, don't mess around with that stuff. Next up is from LS. How much does it actually cost to make a bike in relation to sale price? Do you know what? I have no idea. That's a really good idea for a video. And I think perhaps, just looking at my bike here for inspiration, I will contact someone who makes like a smaller scale brand, I'll use a UK brand example, someone like a Kotick that's a one-man band. I'll see how much it costs them to make a bike. And then if a bigger manufacturer will answer that question, I'll ask someone bigger, like a Canyon or someone like that. I think that's a really interesting concept to work out how much bikes cost. Because I think a lot of people think that bikes are overinflated, but actually a lot of the time you're paying for the development, you're paying for all the convenience of getting the bike to you. There's always a cheaper way of doing it, but not necessarily the easiest way of doing it. So yeah, it's a good video there. I'll look into that. Next up's from Peter Lennon. Hi Donny, loving the show, been here since day one. Awesome. Man, you've watched a lot of these, so you've watched 147 of these shows. You must be one of our best subscribers, thank you. Can you mix and match hubs and rims, and what are your thoughts? Yeah, of course you can, as long as they're the correct hole, i.e. you'll get a 28 hole hub and a 28 hole rim, although some wheel builders can mess around. Basically, you could lace up a 32 hole hub, for example, on a 36 hole rim. It's not the best thing to do, but you can do that. And as far as brands go, yeah, it's one of the most exciting things is speccing a set of wheels yourself, picking the nipples you want, the colour nipples. You might want like DT Pro Locks, for example, or you might want some cool anodized ones to match the colours on your bike. You might want bladed bladed spokes, single butted, triple butted, double butted spokes. There's loads of options out there, coloured ones even. You can pick your rim and you can pick your hubs. Go ahead and do it. Yeah, it can cost a lot more, but you get a hand-built set of wheels. And if you fancy it, you can have a go at doing that yourself. Now, if that is something that scares you, you can always ask your local mechanic for a bit of a demo on how they do it. And if they've got the time on their hands and they're acceptant enough to do it, they might let you lace up one of your own wheels, and then they'll take care of the tensioning and the truing bit, which ultimately is the hard bit in building a wheel. Lacing a wheel is great fun, quite therapeutic. Maybe we'll revisit building wheels here on GMBN Tech. So I've not built one for quite a few years now, to be fair. But yeah, definitely do it. It's one of the coolest things to do is spec your own wheels instead of buying off-the-shelf ones. Next one's from GasCan157. I heard that storing a mountain bike vertically by the front wheel, like from a ceiling hook, can potentially cause fork seals to leak or lead to fork dysfunction. Is there any truth to it? What are the best ways to store mountain bikes to save space? I've got broken wrists, I'm sorting out my bike cave in the meantime, and could use some advice. Okay, so firstly, that's complete nonsense. You can store one of the other myths is by storing a bike vertically, you mess up your brakes. No, if your brakes are bled, there won't be any air in them for them to mess up. What happens is if you're hanging your bike vertically, for example, the air will naturally sort of migrate to the top where the levers are. When you get your bike down and the brakes don't work, it's because you've got air in there. But you can actually use that process to get the air out by leaving your master cylinders open if you fold your levers flat. It's a cool little hack, that. And with regards to forks, look at the layout on a pair of forks. So I'm just looking at mine here so I can sort of describe this to you. In the bottom of most telescopic suspension forks these days, you have lower leg lubricants. It's essentially a form of suspension oil in there, and its job is to lubricate those upper legs. They're telescopic, so sliding in and out. You've got the bushes on the inside, effectively like a bearing that supports that fork. And then of course you've got the seals. For them to work correctly, obviously they've got to be clean, but that oil has got to migrate into there. Yeah, and it's got to sort of do its thing. So by hanging the bike vertically, you're actually letting that oil drain all the way towards those seals, and it actually makes them work amazingly well. Now, if you have your bike in the correct position, i.e. the riding position all the time, we actually recommend here and there, put your bike upside down for a while. And some manufacturers actually say it's a good idea to do this if you're not keen on doing maintenance of your forks yourself, to get some of that oil back towards where the seals are, to get them doing it. Now, if there's any oil or residue coming out, that just happens on your seals from time to time, so don't worry about that. I actually hang my bikes vertically. And to save space, what I do is I actually remove the front wheels from them so they get closer to the wall. So I have got room to hang bikes in my workshop vertically with wheels on, but actually I can get more in if I take the front wheels off, cross the handlebars, and I do them top and tail. And I can get about 6 bikes in there, no problem, and slot the wheels in between them all, and it works really well. Got ground anchor on the floor, daisy chain all the bikes together, and then down to the ground anchor with a different chain. It's a great system, works really well. So yeah, maybe you should check that out. And in fact, there should be some pictures on screen of my workshop, so just so you can get an idea of that. Last question this week is from Jan Herriot. Is there a risk to keeping a Rockshox dropper post open? Dot brake fluid captures humidity and cannot be kept after opening it. Is there the same problem? Well, it sounds like you're referring to the oil on the inside. Now, oil on the inside of your brakes is very different to the oil on the inside of suspension components and moving components like dropper posts. Now, dropper post works very similarly to a suspension. item like a shock or a fork. And accordingly, in fact, I have got some here. Give me a second to rummage around. I have some Rockshox Reverb oil actually in a little pouch. I was going to do a little bit of a job on a friend's bike. Now this oil is just hydraulic oil. That's all it is. You could use this in a suspension fork. And in fact, I think this particular one is it's 2.5 weight oil. That's all it is. So once you open that, it's safe to close it. It will not ingest fluid in the same way that DOT brake fluid can. So anyone out there that's got any confusion with this, mineral fluid in brakes and DOT fluid are two different things. DOT is basically stands for Department of Transportation. It's a regulated oil. And one of the issues with this oil, despite the fact it's an amazing oil, is once you open a container of it, it can start to ingest moisture into it. Now that leads to inconsistencies in time. However, DOT fluid is amazing. You just have to make sure you sort of replace it every now and then. Like we're talking like annually, you know, not like every few rides. So it's no problem. And it's the same system that you'll see on your cars and on your motorbikes. And when you go for servicing, they recommend changing your brake fluid every certain amount of miles. It's the same process. Mineral fluid is hydrophobic, I think the term is. It doesn't, it actually repels moisture. So you can actually afford to have a bigger container and just use it when you need to and leave it open. Wouldn't recommend leaving it open, but I think you get the gist there. Well, there we go. That's the end of another Ask GMBN Tech. If you've got any questions or comments, you know where to put them. Get involved down there and we'll see you in the next show. See you later.